Right, so welcome everyone to our concluding roundtable, in which we would like, in a sort of hopefully interactive format, to discuss the role of technology in the transition towards sustainable agriculture. And although the title says technology, we are actually going to speak about one specific technology because that technology is at the moment the most controversial one when it comes to agriculture. And is also, well, I'm talking here about green biotechnology, of course. So the use of genetic modification in plants and seeds. And over the last 20 to 30 years, EU regulation of what we refer to as GMOs, genetically modified organisms, although I know it's not the technically correct term here, but EU regulation of GMOs over the last 20, 30 years has been one of the most difficult and polarized areas of EU policymaking due to very different views of different actors about its risks and benefits. But also because of persistent member state non-compliance and public opposition to GMOs and their use in cultivation in Europe. And many books have actually been written about GMOs and the GMO controversy, including, you know, this humble author trying to identify the lessons that we must learn, or that EU regulation must learn from the debacle around GMO cultivation in Europe in the last 20, 30 years. And today, when I finished my book, I was done with GMOs for a while, and I really don't want to talk about this anymore. And now it seems that the topic is coming back in a new shape. And that is because we are today facing, there's been advancement in biotechnology, and the new development is today new genomic techniques, or so-called NGTs, and those are seen as a technological revolution in biotechnology, with potential applications in various sectors such as agriculture, medicine, anti-aging. Basically going to make us immortal. One of the most innovative NGTs is CRISPR-Cas9, which can be described as genetic Caesars, which allow the cutting and editing of DNA sequences. And the discovery of CRISPR-Cas has earned its developers, Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020. Now, NGTs are seen by some as the most promising tools to address urgent challenges of our time, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and public health. So there is a strong sustainability narrative that's being embraced based on the use of this technology. And for others, the use of NGTs in agriculture is simply the perpetuation of the currently unsustainable extractive agri-food model, which maintains control of food and land in the hands of few powerful agribusinesses, while raising significant ethical, social, and environmental concerns. The legal framework for NGTs, and this is, after that I'm going to pass on the word to you, but I just want to give you a quick overview of the legal situation at EU level right now. The legal framework for NGTs is under review following a request from the Council of the European Union and a ruling of the Court of Justice in 2018. Which basically ruled that organisms obtained with NGTs should be treated the same as conventional GMOs. And this means that most NGTs right now require pre-market authorization and labeling and traceability if companies want to bring these products on the market. In July this year, the European Commission adopted a proposal for a new regulation on the use of NGTs. The proposal is part of a package to support the EU Farm to Fork strategy. And the EU biodiversity strategy, and if adopted, the new legislation would essentially deregulate the use of NGT products in seeds and plants for feed and food purposes. And basically not requiring prior authorization anymore, but requiring some specific labeling and traceability. The proposal is currently being discussed in the European Parliament. Beginning of November, there was a meeting of the Environmental Committee discussing the proposal. And yeah, I think the discussion of NGTs right now is really indicative of the very ambiguous nature of the notion of food sustainability. And it also illustrates once again that there are very different visions and different interests involved in this discussion. And so I personally believe that, as it was the case with GMOs, the discussion about how to regulate NGTs cannot be narrowed down to this false dichotomy between precaution on the one hand and innovation on the other. And that is very much what we are experiencing in the policy debate right now, again. So in this roundtable, I hope that we can take a broader perspective and also discuss questions which are not currently being discussed in the EU policy debate, namely, which vision of sustainability is being promoted, whom this vision is likely to benefit, who will lose out, and how does the deregulation of NGTs in agriculture fit in with a food system approach to sustainability, which basically requires a holistic perspective on how the food operates and impacts, which impacts it creates on people and the planet. And so we are very fortunate to have with us today 4 distinguished speakers who can share their insights and different perspectives on this topic. I will introduce you now first, and then we will start the discussion. So Michel Haring is a molecular plant biologist and director of the Swammerdam Institute for Life Sciences here at the UvA. He and his group have been using genetic modification techniques for more than 30 years in their research to study how plants use chemicals to communicate with other organisms. This should eventually lead to crops that are more resilient and can defend themselves against pests and diseases. And with public lectures and participating in public debates, Michel tries to create awareness for developments in our food systems. Then I'm very pleased to have Helene Schmutzler with us, who has a background in political science and sustainable development. Helene currently works as policy coordinator at IFOAM, Organics Europe, the European umbrella organization for the organic food and farming movement. Helene closely follows legislation on genetic engineering and animal welfare. And before joining IFOAM Organics, she researched European environmental politics and climate diplomacy at KU Leuven, and also worked for the Auckland Institute, a policy think tank reporting on injustices around natural resource and water grabbing in various African countries. We also have with us Michel Habets, who is a senior researcher at the Rathenau Institute here in the Netherlands. Michel studies socially relevant aspects of various developments in the field of synthetic biology, agricultural biotechnology, and medical biotechnology. Michel studied biology and philosophy at the Radboud University Nijmegen, and healthcare ethics and law master at Manchester University. And you have 2 PhD degrees, is this correct? One on the evolution of microbial diversity from Wageningen University, and the second one on medical ethics at the University Medical Center Utrecht. And you're currently a visiting researcher in Wageningen. And then, last but not least, we have Sabine Weiland, who already participated in the conference in the first panel today, who is an associate professor of political science at the Catholic University of Lille, and an expert on food democracy. And you, Sabine, currently participate in Horizon Europe project, Demetra, which from next year on will study the transformation of urban food systems in European cities and its contribution to achieving the goals of the European Green Deal. So you will be enlightening us from a very broad food democracy perspective. All right, so the format is as follows. First, the 4 speakers I invited to make their opening statements, which will be guided by short questions from me. And so each of you have about 5 minutes for the opening statements. And after that, we go in a moderated dialogue with sort of more questions and reactions, and also inviting the audience in. Yeah. So let's begin with Michel, another plant scientist. Could you tell us what are NGTs and why do we need them?
Okay, 5 minutes, huh?
Yes.
No, I think that you already explained that the NGTs are based on a genetic modification technique, and the CRISPR system comes from a bacterium, so it's not a plant trait, nothing. So it is definitely genetic modification, and if you bring that into a plant, then it will be directed to a single gene to make a change possible. So I thought I would have 2 tomatoes here, one yellow one and a normal orange one. And the difference is a single difference in the gene. And so if you as a company would not have a yellow tomato yet, you could do CRISPR-Cas on the orange one, and then it would knock out a gene and you would have a yellow tomato. If you know something about breeding, because this is all about plant breeding, making a new tomato will take you 5 to 10 years of your life. So if you are thinking of going into plant breeding, the output is relatively small, but still, this is what we can do. So these NGTs are there to introduce traits that we already know into a new or in a different crop. So if you know something from tomato, you can also use this knowledge, for instance, in grape, or maybe in maize, or anyone. So the idea is that you can use knowledge that we already have, traits that we already know, and because you know exactly which gene is involved, or genes are involved, then you can change that with these NGTs and make a new product. And the big selling point is that this will take you only a few years, because nothing else changes but this gene. So your tomato has all the other qualities that it takes: yield, disease resistance. You only change the color, and that will take you a few years. So instead of spending 5 or 10 years, a new trait can be easily incorporated. So that is essentially what an NGT system can do. I hope that is clear.
What is the difference to GMOs then? Why are they different?
It is not different to a GMO in the beginning, because you have to bring in this bacterial gene to do something, and then we all realize this is a genetically modified plant. But the trick here is that if you cross a plant, you can mix the chromosomes in such a way that the bacterial gene that you've introduced is lost in the next generation. So the next generation will have the change, but no longer have this bacterial gene. So in a sense, you have lost the footprint of the GMO, so the new product no longer has anything that you can prove it is a gene. So this is the big selling point as well. Nobody can tell where this yellow color came from. I could have found it somewhere on the streets. It could have been, well, anyway. So that is a selling point, but it means also that NGT product can never be traced back to a GMO event.
It would be also really great if you could explain to us your personal view on the potential of this technology to contribute to sustainable agriculture, because I know that you are also have an opinion on that.
Yeah.
So what is the potential, and what are the chances that that potential will be realized under the current European legislation?
As always, it says it has great potential to contribute to sustainability. You cannot be more vague, I think. And I think that is true. It has great potential and it can contribute to sustainability. This is why there are so many scientists that think that this is a great tool. Because yes, we work on, for instance, disease resistance. So if you can make a tomato resistant against a certain disease, you do no longer have to spray pesticides, and that would be a great contribution to sustainability. But I told you, we can only do that if we know what we have to change. if you would have to do that in tomato, this tomato would already be available. And then you can copy it with the new genomic technique. So the innovation level of these NGTs, in my opinion, it's a copy-paste, or we've heard it all, wine in new bottles. That is what NGTs are very good for. So in a sense, they could do something very positive. And for instance, if you would take the comparison between tomato and grape plant breeding is terrible. If you cannot breed a Pinot Noir, because it is a Pinot Noir, and nobody knows how to make a Pinot Noir. You can only make cuttings, so nothing changes. So if you would like to have a Pinot Noir that is resistant against certain molds, you are lost, because you would have to do a cross, and there goes your Pinot Noir. So if you would have an NGT that would help you to change this Pinot Noir to a resistant cultivar, that would be great. So in that sense, it has the possibility to contribute to sustainability for certain questions. But what I see is that in the past, and you know that as well, 30 years ago, we also had the same discussion. With GMOs, we can feed the world. It literally said in Science and Nature, we will be able to feed the world. And what happened with GMOs? We only have herbicide resistance and insect toxic plants. And I can already see, if I look in the patent databases, that companies are already patenting again new herbicides, and will be making new plants that are resistant to herbicide, and they will be selling this. So you can believe in the good, but you have to expect the bad. So I'm not a believer. I want to see scientific evidence, and my evidence is 30 years of experience has shown that if you give this to the market, they will do something.
So I'd like to come back to that, but first I would like to give Helene the word. Helene, the organic sector has a vision of sustainable food that is based on principles of care, health, ecology, and fairness. Are NGTs compatible with that vision?
Yes, thank you for the question, because it's a very important question for our movement that we have also been dealing with really intensively in the last 10 years. So we had a very thorough and very time-consuming and arduous consultation process on this, actually on the international level and on the European level. So after many years of discussion, there was a position paper which was published by the international mother organization of us, IFOAM International. And we also passed another resolution at our General Assembly this summer, so that we are really clear and unified. And with a 97% majority, this resolution was passed, that we came to the conclusion, no, NGTs or new GMOs are not compatible with the principles of organic farming, with the precautionary principle, and also consumer expectations of what organic should deliver on. And quite frankly, we are also skeptical about the sustainability promises that are out there and that are kind of being mobilized and used as a narrative to legitimize the current regulatory process. So I'm really happy that Michel already mentioned that the history of where GMOs have brought us until now, even though we kind of hear the same promises that are being repeated now, that were first also involved in the GMO debate. And also, to give you a practical example, in Spain, we have GMO cultivation, and specifically there was a maize which had a Bt toxin, which means that the plant already in itself has a resistance, so you don't need to spray additional pesticides. That's the idea. But then several years later, the corn borer, which is an insect to which the resistance was supposed to be effective, was already resistant to the Bt toxin. So, and next to that, there were also negative impacts on pollinators, and so it had also impacts on non-target species. But okay, that's GMOs. Let's move on to these new GMOs. And if we look at what's out there in active cultivation right now, we have one lettuce in the US, which is non-browning. So there's an enzyme change which makes it look greener, longer. And we have also a GABA tomato, which basically it's supposed to lower the blood pressure. So these are not the big sustainability challenges that we are facing at the moment, right? And the GRC had a study which showed the current NGTs, and 6 out of 16 were related to pesticide resistance. So the promises that we are hearing are nowhere in the reality of what is actually out there, and it's very hypothetical to say that we cannot abandon 30 years of biosafety and consumer information based on hypothetical promises. And the last point is that the rich experience in organic farming has shown that there are no shortcuts to circumvent the complexity of our food system. Innovation is absolutely necessary, but it's not reserved to genetic engineering or gene editing. And if anything, you need a holistic approach to agriculture, which looks at also your soil health. So for example, for drought resistance, what matters much more than, for example, the length of the roots, which is important for drought resistance, is the state of your soil, the water retention capacity of the soil. And so it's a much more systemic approach which is needed, rather than claiming that single traits or varieties are sustainable. And I want to repeat it again because it's really important. There are no shortcuts to circumvent the complexity of our food systems.
Very clear. Thank you, Helene. Michel, I would like to move on to you. You have been closely following the discussions both on GMOs and now also on NGT. And you have been, in your work, observing this strong polarization of the debate. So there's one group, one narrative that strongly focuses on risks and safety, and another narrative that focuses on denying that there is any risks, for example, consequences for public health, and emphasizing the innovation and sort of the discussion between precaution and innovation, going back and forth. And it seems to me, and I believe that's also what you have been writing about, that is very reductionist, right? What could you tell us, based on your work, what we are missing in the current discussion, and what should we be talking about when thinking about a policy on NFTs at EU level?
Yeah, so I think what we see here, we actually see with a lot of technologies. So when policymakers are designing, a governance framework for new technologies, they're often relying on scientific knowledge. And of course, in our high-tech society, it's really necessary because our political and our society problems are very complex. But at the same time, we've also seen, and I think the Corona crisis was this beautiful example, that if you only rely on scientific evidence, that's a limitation, because yes, we need to know how the virus spreads and how we can contain that. But there are also other values like the loneliness of elderly, like the mental health of our children, freedom, economic values. And so they need to be all taken into account. And so there is this weighing of different perspectives. And this was actually not done when in the 90s, the GMO regulation was, developed. And it's actually, and so what you saw there was, and that's a lot of times with technologies, that is if there are no risks, then then the economic, the economic value is really important. So if it can give you some economic benefits, then the regulation is just like a technical regulation, and that's what's been done a lot. But at the same time, with the GMO, it's also seen now, looking back by social scientists saying, well, this is also one of the problems why there was a controversy, that you didn't take into account all of these social economic values that are important, and ethical values. And if we look at, like when I've been looking at this debate, then you see a similar thing. And I think it's changing now a little bit because it seems that the opponents of changing regulation are becoming more vocal now. Maybe it's also just because of the world that I've been in, that it's mostly been the dominant stakeholders. But and you see the same thing. So over the past few years, like questions like, what do NGTs, what would it mean for small scale farmers in the global south? Those questions weren't really valid, or they weren't really asked. And so what I've seen, at least, and I've been kind of like at a sideline, like, going to meetings, going to stakeholder meetings arranged by the government in the last 6 years, but also going to scientific meetings. And every time, like at some point, there's this question, how can we convince the public that these NGTs are a necessity for us? And there is, there is no function on like the assumptions that are present in this. So on the one hand, there is this assumption that the public needs to be convinced, and basically the public is being seen as consumers. Consumers need to be convinced that they need to buy this product, instead of seeing the public as like a stakeholder in our future, in the future of our food system. And on the other hand, the assumption like, do we need to how can we convince the public of the necessity is also, of course, is the assumption that this is, necessary, that it is a necessity for sustainability or for, feeding the world. And of course, that can also be questioned, and it is questioned by opponents, of course, that there are alternative ways to, to deal with sustainability. And maybe just one more thing, I think there's also a lack, or there has been a lack in the meeting that I've been to, on exactly, I guess, what everyone has kind of been saying along all today. What is sustainability, right? Because if you would ask, an NGO, then they would tell you that small scale farmer, that their livelihood is also about sustainability, like equality and fairness, and like that's also part of sustainability. Whereas if you look at the proposal that there is now from the European Commission, it's got an extremely narrow definition, I guess, of sustainability, because if you look at the list of what is supposed to be sustainable and that you can get some kind of help with, them, they're all like these, much better than me, but you wonder what is not sustainable. It's and I think that's a problem. So there has been, in my point of view, very little reflection on a lot of assumptions, and possibly just because it's such a controversial area, that people feel the need maybe to take a stand, or
Thank you. So let me move on to Sabine for your opening statement. Sabine, regulation of GMOs and now of NGTs has always been treated as an issue for experts and technocrats. And mostly it has been treated that way by both policymakers and the business community. It's something where science is needed, and only those who have access to proper science can make a judgment about the value of this technology. You work on food democracy. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see the debate from the perspective of food democracy, and what can we learn about food democracy by looking at the discussion around NGTs, and vice versa? What can we learn from food democracy? What could NGTs teach us about food democracy?
Thank you for these questions. I must admit, I don't feel to be very much an expert on that.
That's perfect. That's ideal.
I honestly had to Google what NGTs, what that so yeah. I'm really only talking from a more general perspective of somebody who's working on sustainability, governance, and transformation questions and democracy questions. And maybe that also reflects the perspective of the general public. They are kind of clueless and don't understand what's going on. So my let's say first reaction to your question is coming from a sustainability angle, and I was wondering if technology, and NGTs in particular in this case, if technology is the answer, what does this tell us about the problem? So the sustainability problem to which technology is supposed to provide a solution is framed as one that is a technical or an optimization problem. And it is also a problem that can be fixed with technology. So this is the whole logic in my understanding. And well, this is super if that's possible. So I'm not at all against technology. I'm certainly in favor of making our lives easier to be more efficient and less wasteful in terms of resources. So wherever that is appropriate, then I'm all good with that. But the problem from a sustainability angle is that not all, or maybe most of the sustainability problems are not of that type. So sustainability problems, in my perspective, are structural problems of our current food systems, or also in more general terms, the current ways of producing and consuming food and other things in society. So these are systemic problems where everything is kind of connected. And addressing these problems will therefore require to reconsider these qualities of a structural problem and these fundaments of our society, of our ways of living. So to come up with a technical fix might look good or might solve some issues, but it will not be addressing the whole picture. So therefore, my plea would be in favor of a broader perspective, and probably also all hands on deck. So it's the scientists that are kind of leading the expert discussion. I mean, there are some more stakeholders actually involved who should also be involved, have a say in that, and maybe then the question of how to translate these expert discussions into the public realm become an issue, in order to then arrive at a broader discourse on the usefulness and the potential and maybe also the limitations of that kind of technologies. So what I see currently, and now I'm coming finally to your question, is that in this scenario, the discussion about NGTs and technology in general can also be a distraction, because might divert attention from what is actually needed in terms of addressing the structural sustainability problems. And you said that very beautifully earlier. So there are no shortcuts, you said, to reduce the complexity of our food system. And you, Michel, also said something similar. Complexity is always multidimensional. There are various viewpoints to be taken into account, and therefore to focus only on that technical fix is not broad enough. Full stop.
Thank you. So I would like to raise the urgency a little bit, and let's remember, we are talking about a proposal that is about to deregulate the use of at least a certain type of NGT products. And I'm not going into the technical details because there are certain techniques which will still require authorization and others that will be deregulated. Now, could we clarify what are the stakes here, where if that happens? So first, Michel, perhaps again, the plant scientist perspective, Michel, what are the potential? I mean, on the promises side, we hear promises about drought resistance, about less pesticides use, and about also heat-resistant plants, etc. But what could be the potential negative consequences of releasing this onto the market?
Yeah, well, I think first that the potential that you mentioned is already very questionable, because if it were the case that we could use this NGT to introduce such a trade, we would already have done it by normal breeding. Then we would know what to do, because NGTs can only copy what we know, and we don't know exactly how to handle that. So for many plants, it's not clear how to create a crop that is really drought resistant, really heat tolerant, because that is very complicated. We do have very old organic or land races that do well, but they don't have the yield that you will have with a high input rate. So yeah, again, it's the complexity that is just put aside.
Yeah.
And of course, the people that believe in this have done the experiments. I also have done CRISPR experiments that show clear differences, that can show a big impact, but it's not as simple as that. So it will, with the NGTs, you will not create something new. You can copy something. So it's very strange because all over Europe, people are investing, countries are investing in looking more at the interaction from plants with the soil, for instance. We have bread plants that are blind, dumb, deaf, numb, sitting in wheelchairs, and we help them. And this is what we call agriculture. And now we see that the help is coming with a big cost, and we would like them to be able to stand with their own feet again. And that means that we have to rethink and re-ask the question, can plants do that? And we ask microbes to help them. So there's, in the scientific community, people are convinced that this is the way to create robust, resilient plants, to have combinations of soil and combination of genetic traits that we have lost. We are even going back to the roots of all these plant species. So I find it strange that on the one hand, scientific community says it's much more complex. And then there's a group of people that says, no, these NGTs will solve everything, because that is not the case. But what is the case, if I am a chemist at Syngenta, or Bayer, or BASF, I have a lot of chemical materials which will kill plants. And these herbicides, or plant protection compounds, as they are nicely called, I would call them toxic chemicals, they are very easily to use to find a plant that is resistant against it. You can easily select, that's no problem. You can easily find out what is the genetic basis, and you can copy that using an NGT. So with every toxic chemical that you develop to kill weeds, you will be able to create a crop that does not suffer from this toxic compound. And this is big business. If you read the economic, this is law, sorry. If you would read the economic papers, they are predicting more than 10% growth in the generation of new combinations of chemicals and resistant plants. This is like, it's not trillion, but it's really big. And so I'm not convinced that if we give it to the market, because this is what happens. If you say we make an exception for all these NGTs, it's for everything. And it's gone forever. You lawyers should know this is gone forever. Never, 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 this is going to be turned around again. So if we have one day to think about it, I think it's January 11th or something like that. Before that, we should realize what harm is it to say we will only use it for this and this and this. How difficult is it if you know what your targets are to say, okay, this is great, but for the first round of exceptions, this is where we will only use it. And we will not use it for herbicide tolerance. I find it so embarrassingly simple that people don't do that. So that, I think that is a big thing. I'm going.
That's because you're not a lawyer, not where. In EU law, apparently there's a lot of reasons not to do that. But what I'd like to clarify is what you're saying is you're not in favor of completely banning the use of this technology in agriculture.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to treat it in the same way as GMOs are treated right now, if I understand correctly. Yeah. But you would be in favor of a tailored framework that would, in a way, have some form of assessment that would evaluate the actual contribution to problems.
Take this Pinot Noir story. This is a real story. We spent so much chemicals on these grapes to make wine. If it were so simple that I use an NGT and then I have a resistant Pinot Noir, let's do it. Because we want that Pinot Noir. Or the alternative, of course, take another wine, take another grape. But so I can think of economic reasons to stay with the Pinot Noir, and then an NGT can help us develop that.
Yeah.
And there I would say, I would like to discuss that. Is that a good idea or
Yes.
not? I'm not against, people always think I'm against NGTs. This is my daily work. I love them. I know what they can do, but if you put it into economy or into society, that's a different story. So I would be like a case, but I always teach my students, technology is not good or bad. You have to look at the case where you use it. And that is in this case, I've discussed the grape with my students and they were uncertain, like, would we do it or would we do it, not do it? There were Pinot Noir lovers in the audience.
There's a question in the, I'm happy to already now start including questions from the audience. So let's take you hands first.
Just try to bring law and your field together. So in law you have different, in case of uncertainties, different rules, so to say. One is no unless, that's what in theory is applied to nature conservation policy. Another one is yes but, and yes but there are different grades, of course. But to if you are to choose,
No,
would
unless.
it be okay?
Sorry, what was that?
No, unless.
No, unless. Okay, because yes, but we see a lot of different varieties, and we talked about glyphosate. It's also yes, but the but is problematic.
Yeah, if you say yes, but you lose.
Yeah,
Because lawyers
okay.
are much smarter.
So no,
than I am.
unless that would
If
be
you
your
say
advice.
no, unless, then you have discussion. Which is what I've already said. Also against GMOs, I can show that 1994. I said no, unless you can prove to me that this is useful, and they have never been able to do that.
And just let me just say that Anastasia Alizu earlier today told me that it is basically impossible to ban something that's considered as safe and not let it enter the market and only let some products that we consider as valuable onto the market and not others. So there's a real problem with the kind of tools that we have at our disposal in EU law and regulation in tackling this problem.
But can I just say one thing?
Yes,
Because I think the problem also with this new proposal, the new regulation, is that there actually isn't a free market anymore. So it's being put on the market, but it's not labeled, and that's not a free market. So for instance, consumers can't really choose, and so they can't. So they can also not show that they're not interested and they do not want that. And so I think even if you say like, okay, so like we can't prohibit it, so let's bring that to the market, then at least make it a free market.
Yes, and I didn't forget your questions, but I do think this is quite important for Helene's work as well. And it's coming back to the stakes, because could you talk a little bit about this issue of traceability, which seems to be basically practically impossible for this kind of genetic modification, and what it means for the organic sector once it is on the market and we cannot really enforce labeling on traceability.
But so first of all, I wanted to make a clarification for this debate, because I think it's really important to have a common understanding. We are not talking about a prohibition of any technology. GMOs are not prohibited. They are allowed in Europe. They are being cultivated. It's just the question is, how do we regulate them? So what is at stake right now for NGTs is a new regulatory framework that is basically lighter for, again, in two categorizations, technical details, but lighter in terms of risk assessment, and then lighter or completely abandoning labeling for producers and labeling for consumers. So we have never talked about prohibiting GMOs and neither NGTs. Just, I really, this needs to be clear. And then what is at stake for the organic movement, but also the conventional GM-free sector? Actually, we have a 20 million euro business of conventional GM-free production, which is often forgotten. It's basically freedom of choice for GM-free producers, including organic, because for some NGTs, traceability requirements would fall away. And what does traceability mean? It means that throughout the entire supply chain, you will be able to tell whether a certain crop or product has been used in which genetic engineering has been involved. So products containing GMOs or produced by GMOs or NGTs. And so this means that throughout the whole supply chain, you can also take measures to avoid unintended presence. And this is really relevant for each step. So we are talking about processing. I know that 80% of food in Germany at least is processed. And out of those 80%, processing is done in hybrid facilities. So they treat conventional products and organic products. So you need to have some sort of system of separation within processing facilities. Often products don't just undergo one processing step, but multiple processing steps. We talk about storage, about transport, etc. So this is what a traceability system would really ensure, that up until the consumer, you would really know what is in your products.
Is this possible? Is this possible?
Yeah. So what's an important distinction is whether there's a detection method, which is what Michel was mentioning, that the difference between GMOs and NGTs is that you cannot analytically detect, for example, through PCR testing, whether a genetic modification process had been taking place. So that's on a detection method level, but traceability, of course, functions without detection method. We have plenty of traceability-based, so process-based products. Child labor. Can you see in an apple whether child labor has been used? No. Same for organic. You cannot see in the product, looking at it, whether this is an organic banana or a conventional banana. It's because we have traceability processes in place which really adhere to certain regulations, so that you can see, okay, this product is credibly organic. So traceability would function without detection methods, but we have been talking with Corteva and Monsanto also, and what they say is that they don't want traceability because it will lead to consumer labeling. Because if you can trace it up until the last step of the product, it means that it's very easy to put a label for consumers, which we know consumers don't want. And I hope that you can also get to expand on the studies that you've been doing, which are very valuable to understand current consumer wishes. But yeah, so traceability is absolutely important for the organic movement. It's feasible. Put aside detection methods, it's still feasible. But it has political implications for freedom of choice for consumers. So that's why it's kind of, yeah, debated on the policy level.
I'd like to take a couple of questions now from the audience. So I saw Hannah, you had your hand up, and now I see Alessandra as well.
Yeah, so actually, and then you already answered some parts of it, and I'm very happy about the clarification, especially that you made, because I do think it's necessary to go into some of the legal detail, because that's where the juice is, as it were. Because now we're focusing on the sustainability debate, but I do think the debate starts first with this question of, okay, so we actually entirely deregulate for plants that have natural traits or that are comparable to conventional ones. And that's very atypical, because in the European Union, if you have a new processing method and you extract something from a potato with a new processing method, you still need an authorization. And it's very unconventional in this sort of thinking in the European Union that you would put pretty much anything new on the market without any type of control, right? So I think that's the first thing, that the proposal just goes really far in deregulation, right, for that particular category. And I don't know if you know Niels Lauwers, but he always likes to underline that actually natural. He's a planter. Yeah, but he likes to underline that actually natural doesn't mean safe, right? So the question is actually, could natural not also mean unsafe, at least for the ecological system, right? And then I just want to reply with a legal technicality on this no but sort of idea. And in the United States, there's the essential use doctrine, which essentially translates into a legal principle what you're suggesting. And that doctrine has even found resonance in the chemical strategy because they actually want to restrict chemicals under a no but categorization. That means that you can only put chemicals on the European market if you can they fulfill an essential use for our society. So there isn't, you know, the promise that that's actually going to become reality, but there is a legal doctrine that can very well translate actually the limitation here. Looking forward.
That would be great.
Thank you, Hannah, for making a constructive proposal. Alessandra?
Yes, so for me, it's a comment. First, thanks a lot because I have not to follow the debate and I find it extremely fascinating. One comment I have is this view of, you know, science-based versus other values. Because I think that with GMO, and now if I listen to you, there is no science base that indicates that we should deregulate. This is a pick and choose of the Commission of which science and which scientific question ought to be answered. Because here I listen to a scientist with pointing out some risks. Are these risks considered? So there is this cutting off the scientific discourse and then calling it science-based. If you think of the climate debate 20 years ago, it was a little bit the same, right? We couldn't have climate policy because there was not enough scientific evidence in a sense. So this hijacking of the scientific discourse by a particular regulatory apparatus, I think we should resist. We shouldn't talk of science-based when the Commission says that it's science-based. There is many scientists. So with, if I hear this conversation, I hear, okay, there might be a risk of increase of the use of pesticides, which strikes me as possibly not good for the environment. How has this been assessed, if at all? I guess it has not, right? So what science are we talking about? So always putting the lay public or as the non-scientific counterpart, I think it's really problematic. We have 20 years of STS scholarship that teaches us how science is constructed, and I think it's about time to resist the narrative of the Commission and of some other states that just label science-based, but it's a particular vision of science, usually grossly co-produced by corporate scientists. So if we could change the discourse there, I would be very happy.
But
this is a quick question. I just don't know the answer, which is, does it, I mean, this category of NGTs, does it make sense to think about all of these technologies together as NGTs? Does it make sense to think about them separately? I just wonder, as we categorize it as, one clump of technologies, how that shapes the way we think about regulating it. Or are there other ways of thinking about it?
I would like to take. So I wish I'd read this article because it's supposed to be a really good article, but I haven't. But there apparently, it shows really nicely how and I think it's in Norway or Sweden, how it's actually the scientific community that has kind of come up with this, narrative that this is not a GMO. And then and at first they were called new breeding technologies, to make sure it was like traditional breeding, and then the European court said that it was a GMO, and then that's swapped to new genomic techniques. But you could argue that it is a GMO legally. It's a GMO. So
now.
Yeah, I mean. But but it's a narrative that is necessary because everyone knows that. I mean, and this is my interpretation. Everyone knows that the public doesn't want GMOs. So if you're going to call it a GMO, you're going to have the same problem. So you have to come up with something to, to convince the public that it's different.
Yeah, and the two different groups that they have now, it's the same story. They both are GMOs, period. But we just want to make them more fancy. And we wanna keep you all quiet, and we call them NGTs, and we label them as being sustainable, but it's just GMO. And yeah, so it's a nasty game, I think. And there's the group that we talked about, the CRISPR-Cas, the gene editing. Okay, we've discussed that, but there's another one that says, oh, if I put a potato gene in a potato, that's also great. That is also an NGT. This has already been done for 20 years. So what is the N in this GT? But this is again what Alessandra says. This is the belief of certain scientists, and I can actually name them, and the belief of corporate that this would be good for them. So the whole proposal is based on the belief of a set of scientists, and mainly from the Netherlands, and the support of corporate, mainly the chemical corporate industry. So it has nothing. I have never been asked. And they know where I am, because I always am against something or in favor of something. So it is certainly not a scientific story. It is a belief of a certain set of people that is supported by corporate and chemical industry, not even breeding industry. This is maybe the most striking part. We in the Netherlands produce 50% of all the vegetable seeds worldwide. If you read the papers, never one of these companies has stood up and said, if you don't give us NGT, we will die. Because they can do without it. So what are we talking about? It's for the chemical industry and not for the plant breeding industry.
Just maybe just to add, so what they will tell you, because maybe that's also good to say, that they will tell you the product is the same. So the product of a traditional breeding and the product of an NGT is the same. You can't distinguish it, and that's why it's similar. So they will say, like, why would you regulate it differently if it's actually the same? So that's their reasoning behind, the fact that it's not a GMO.
Yeah. I mean, it was attempted with GMOs before as well. Look at the US, let's do it like in the US, because the US also has the approach of looking at whether they're substantially equivalent to other foods. Giacomo, you had a question.
Yeah, and I'm an outsider to this debate, but I've learned a lot and it's fascinating. And first of all, I think consumers don't know that the big problem is the combination of herbicide and resistant. It's that combination that I understand also from Maria's work. It also did. But so there is a disconnect between what seems to be the real environmental problem and the reasons why consumers don't want and GMOs. So that's one observation. And the other one, are there some of these combinations that are socially desirable? Like, are there some of these sort of herbicide resistant crops that are actually desirable that we've developed them? Because if there are not, maybe we can. Lawyers are inventive. Maybe, the prohibitions can be designed. I don't know. Maybe they can be designed to address those types of uses, those types of combinations.
No, I have never seen a herbicide, and I have seen maybe all that is environmental friendly. It's a contradictio in terms, because it is aimed to kill, and it's toxic to everybody. Although it will kill plants mainly if you have enough in the environment. Look at glyphosate. Again, that doesn't work. If you tell the truth, they will still deregulate it. So, but these are simply made to kill plants, but they will kill anything else. If you would drink it, or you would have to have it for a prolonged period, we all know that. I think that 50 years ago, we were very happy with these weed killers, because we wanted to make a big step in production of our food, and we did. And we didn't know anything about the risk. We didn't do risk assessment. But you cannot say today that we do not know these risks. We know them, we can assess them, and they still are ignored. And I'm afraid I teach a lot on these kind of chemicals and weed science, because There's been a huge increase in the chemicals that have been used in the past years. Only the last 5 or 10 years, nothing new has entered. And that is because everybody knows everything that new that enters has to be more toxic than anything we had before, because we've had that. So it can only get worse. So, yeah, and I think if a chemical company doesn't care, they will sell the compound, and in 20 years they will be sued, and then they will, you know what happens. So that you are the lawyer, so you know how you can extend that until anyway. So I find this the most worrying part. I do believe that you could do great things with it. And that's the wrong word. I'm scientifically convinced that you can do it. I'm not a believer. I'm scientifically convinced that you can do good things. But please describe it before you give such a strong technique free to the market. Please do that. If you don't do that, I hope that I'm wrong. I really hope. This is what I tell my colleagues. They always ask me, why are you against it? Because of this. And I hope I'm wrong.
And let's be clear, when you talk about risks, you talk about risks which can only be appreciated when you look at the different aspects involved. If you look at pesticides use, if you look at what happens to the soil, if you look at public health, it's this holistic perspective that is needed to appreciate the risk, whereas we don't have that in European risk assessment. No? Right now, we don't have that holistic perspective on risk, which is why agencies at the EU level come up with safety assessments, green lighting, these kind of things. So just to be clear on that point, that it's also about a broader understanding of risks and the interrelations between different inputs in agriculture. Let me ask you, all of you, this. We have had in Europe a counter-GMO movement for the last 20, 30 years. It has been considered successful in the sense that it has at least made sure that most of European territory was GMO free. There's very few GMOs that actually are being cultivated in the EU because of the opposition, because of the public pressure, because of basically disobedience in a way, non-compliance with the EU law and pushback. Why? How is it possible that this proposal could now, despite these years of public, perhaps sort of democratic counter movement, why is this? How could the Commission come up with a proposal that goes that far in deregulating?
Maybe if I can make a start. Actually, citizens have been vocal in the current debates. There have been 2 public consultations where citizen engagement has been, exceptionally high compared to other public consultations on other policy files that are being legislated on European level. And also there's been a petition that ran for many months and was concluded in January of 2023, where 420,000 citizens signed that they don't want a change in the current framework, that they want to keep GMOs risk assessed, labeled and traceable. But I think the problem is that the pressure from promoters of NGTs is so high that it's being ignored by the European institutions. And instead of having a very thorough and democratic exchange about weighing different aspects in this debate, it's a very controversial issue. I think a thorough debate is definitely needed, and more citizen engagement and a democratizing of this debate is needed. And instead of doing this, we see the European Council and the European Parliament accelerating this legislative file on policy level. So what we are having is a plenary vote scheduled at the 3rd week of January, and the deadline for amendments in the relevant committees just passed last week with a time span of 3 weeks, which is almost unprecedented in EU history. is to have such a short timeline for members of the European Parliament to submit amendment suggestions. So it's extremely accelerated on the parliamentary side. And then on the council side, currently it's the Spanish government, which was the presidency of the council. And they call this file a matter of life and death of their presidency. It's really the file that they want to push through within the 6 months of the presidency. And they are going to try to aim for a so-called partial approach on 2 chapters of this law by the end of their presidency, which is December. And the file is out since July. So it's absolutely accelerated, which I think the opposite of what such a nuanced and controversial file needs. And citizens have been trying to be vocal, but you can see that the voice is not weighed equally if you look at the pressures of the industry.
Any other reactions? Yeah.
What can we do now? So right.
Maybe we can talk about the Norwegian model. I mean, Michel, you have been writing about the Norwegian model as thinking about constructive ways forward, although probably not something that we can change now, but thinking about a potential different approach. Could you tell us a little bit about what that model is and why you think that could be a better approach to regulating this?
Yeah, so what we did was, so we kind of like, we thought if you take the arguments of both sides seriously, of the proponents and the opponents, so what would you then come up with? And then, you know, you would kind of like want to make it that maybe easier for NGTs to come to the market because that's what the proponents want. But at the same time, you know, the opponents also have certain wishes, and if one of those things is, you know, like, well, it has to contribute to, you know, societal, to some kind of societal benefit or sustainability, then, you know, make that a requirement. And actually in Norway, there is already, you know, like I think since 1993, a regulatory framework where they look at sustainability and they look at ethical aspects and they look at societal benefit. And so only if these criteria are passed, then you are allowed to put a GMO on the market. Now, unfortunately, no company has ever asked for, you know, like market authorization in Norway. So whether in practice it works, and of course, like, you know, it will be, you know, it is problematic, and you still will have all of the problems, like who decides what is sustainable, you know, what is sustainability. So you would still have to go through all of these things, but at least, you know, you're not putting a technology out there. And just, you know, we'll just see what happens, because we know that almost each technology comes with unintended, unforeseen consequences, and we all carry that burden. And actually, usually marginalized communities carry the burden even higher. And so, knowing this, why don't we like start, you know, with new technologies and take GMO, you know, or NGT as the example, start thinking about how we can regulate it in a way that we actually do, you know, like make sure that when something comes to the market, it does have a societal benefit. And Norway is a good example of that, with of course all of its faults and all of its difficulties. Yeah, and I think we did some we looked at what citizens, you know, we had focus group of citizens, and you know, you see that they very much lean towards, you know, like regulation. Like actually, it was unanimous, you know, focus groups. You know, citizens want regulation, and it's actually not for, you know, like what usually is kind of said, like, oh, you know, like Frankenstein food, and the public is just afraid or whatever. The public is very thoughtful, you know, like they go through the process, and you know, they're not like principally opposed. Some people are, you know, because maybe they're like, some of them were, you know, organic, and so then you're principally opposed, which makes sense. But a lot of them, I think, just said, if we really need this, then sure, you know, then we need it. But they wanted it to be risk assessed just to make sure. But they also they looked at, and that's I guess what you were saying, like they looked at the problems in the food system, and they said, but you know, these NGTs are not really like, you know, they don't solve the cause of the problem. You know, and the problems are so complex and multidimensional. It's like how can they, solve them. And then a third thing was that they didn't really think that companies were going to develop, societal beneficial NGTs, because they just said, well, if you look at companies, they usually, it's all about, commercial benefits. So why would it be any different now? Like, why would suddenly all of these companies start making sustainable products? So I think actually citizens were really like, they really look at society. Like, and then that's, I guess, what Michel's trying to say. Like, yes, like maybe some of the scientists think, oh, this is a great technology and we can do like great things with it and we can feed the world. And citizens will say, yeah, but society doesn't work like that because we have a capitalist system and like that's just not going to work. And so in a way, they're very much more nuanced. And and I think they would be fine if we need them. And then again, that would also be a reason to say, well, then develop a regulation so that it comes to the market if we need it.
Alessandra, one last provocative question.
Because so I think, why are we talking of glyphosate now? Or why? Because glyphosate is the pesticide of the GMO. Yeah. And it's not that we are talking of glyphosate for any other reason. And glyphosate is the rock star of pesticide. So the very promise of GMOs that you need to use less toxic chemicals, as you called more intellectually honestly, it's its nemesis. We were given the promise you will use less because you need less. That's technological engineered for this purpose, and we know that this is the most widely used toxic chemicals used for plants in the world. So here there is again the story of science. We have a very strong scientific evidence that link this technology to the use of chemicals, as Michel is making the case, but we cannot speak about it. Now, the only regulation that started to speak about this is the SUR, and that has been pushed back very much, as far as I understood. And my hunch was that actually the approval of glyphosate was that at least the EPP would say yes to the SUR, limiting the target of pesticide. But as far as I follow the debate, the measuring of the lowering the targeting is also a little bit problematic. So we are not really getting to this 50% down, it's very much watered down. So again, it's what is a technology? For what? What risk are we looking at? And now it seems that the main risk here, or one of the main risks, is really the use of chemicals. And we are not, so there is this idea of fostering ignorance. Our European law are fostering ignorance about our knowledge of the use of chemicals. We have on the horizon a little bit, so I think it's really this part that the European law and the way it is conceived now, it doesn't enable us to speak of the problem. It mutes us. It is only scientific to the extent that you look at the little substance glyphosate that is never used alone. It's used with billions of co-formulants of which we know nothing, because that is the number. So it's like, this I am upset because I think if we're really honest, we cannot speak about these things because the law is suppressing our speech, our scientific speech. And so I am with Hannah. What can we do now? Because I didn't follow this file, and I think we should all go in front of the commission and through our ends and say stop before we understand a little bit more. Or we should have a regulation that says yes, but only if pesticide is not used at all. I'm happy.
This part ended up in the Dutch suggestion, but it didn't make it.
Sorry?
I have seen one version that said this cannot be applied to making herbicides tolerant or resistant plants. But that was somewhere in June or somewhere before it came public, so that never made it. So they have thought about it. And apparently that would be legal, but it's out. So I think, what can we do about it? Contact your members of parliament and ask them to vote against it. But I'm sure that we will again have the same as glyphosate, and it will go back to the committee, and the committee will decide to deregulate it. I have no other I can tell you here, we can make a bet, it's going to be deregulated.
After what I've heard today, I'm also very pessimistic about this proposal being improved in the parliament, because what I have seen so far is that the Envy committee rapporteur, who is from the PPP, yeah, she has actually tabled a proposal that goes even further. So I think the parliament is now in a position to. The commission proposal looks much better in the light of that other proposal of the parliament rapporteur.
Maybe I remember that the last time that the European Committee did change and went to the directive that we have from GMOs now, was when the Germans realized that if you cannot have coexistence,
yeah,
you will have what do you call lawsuits. And if you cannot have, and they asked the insurance company, will you be able to give an insurance against these kind of lawsuits? And the insurance company said, we cannot. And then the German government said, we cannot vote for something that you can, the risk you cannot insure. So this is how it went in 1998. So maybe somebody here.
Maybe the Germans.
This is true because this is not traceable or
Yes.
this one
Yes.
traceable.
Yes, well, it's very difficult, yeah.
Anyway.
So I would like to thank you all. Personally, I'm now am convinced that we have to talk about regulation in the context that starts much before marketing, and which is the interrelation, the alliance between scientists and businesses. I think that's where we need to start. That's where the knowledge is being produced. That's where innovations come about, and the question of whether they are societally beneficial is open.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to thank all of you. You have been really going strong. It's been a long day, and I'm really grateful that you were here with us today, and as well as, of course, to the speakers. Thank you. Let's have a drink outside.
And thanks to you, Maria, for
Yeah,
organizing.
Right. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.